Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, I'm looking at a video on the What Would You Say channel, which asks the question, does the Bible endorse slavery? The easy answer is yes, it obviously does. It not only contains instructions on exactly how to set up the institution of slavery, it also instructs slaves to be obedient to their masters and instructs masters not to be overly harsh to their slaves, though, as I'm sure we'll get to, the definition the Bible uses for overly harsh is rather questionable. Anyway, let's get straight to it.
You're in a conversation, and someone says, "The Bible is evil because it endorses slavery." What would you say?
I would agree, and we'd move on with our lives, because that's not a normal conversation that people have. The only time a conversation like this has ever happened in a casual setting is when a Christian is trying to evangelize and the non-Christian is more than likely just looking for a way out of that conversation. Like, I'm a weird person in that I get excited when I see Jehovah's Witnesses coming down the road because now I get to have these discussions that I enjoy having. And this has gotten to the point where they've actually been skipping my house for years now. And despite this is not a track that the conversation has generally taken, ever.
Now, it's true that the Bible, in both the Old and New Testaments, talks about slavery.
That's more than a little bit disingenuous. By talks about, they mean has detailed instructions on how the institution of slavery should be set up. They're also being very picky about the verses that they're choosing. Like, in their graphic, 4 out of 5 of them are relatively tame, either telling us a story where slavery is just a fact of life in the story, rather than the verse itself being either a condemnation or an endorsement of slavery. Well, actually, one of those 4 does seem to lean moderately towards condemnation, with Ezra 9:9 saying, "God has not forsaken us in our slavery, but has extended to us his steadfast love." On its own, this verse seems to recognize that slavery is a bad thing. But right smack dab in the middle, they have 1 Peter 2:18, "Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters." But that's not the end of that verse, and it's not a long one, so I wonder why they finished it where they did. Continuing to the end, "Submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh." So this is a command for slaves to be obedient to their masters, no matter how the master treats them. Okay, I'm beginning to see why they wanted to cut it off before that, but even where they left it, that is a command in the Bible for slaves to obey their masters. If you don't approve of the institution of slavery, you don't then command slaves to obey their masters, especially not if you're writing from a position of authority, which the authors of the epistles definitely were doing. Or at least they considered themselves to be writing from a position of authority, regardless of what the people on the receiving end of those letters might have thought. But it gets worse if you believe that the Bible is the Word of God, because who could be writing from a position of greater authority than the Almighty himself? And it gets even worse when we look at the verses that they left out. 1 Timothy 6:1-2 tells slaves that they should not just obey their masters, but consider their masters worthy of full respect. And if your master is a Christian, be an even better slave than you would be for a non-Christian, since they are dear to you as a fellow believer. Colossians 3:22-24 again instructs slaves to obey their earthly masters in everything, and not just when they're looking, but do it with sincerity of heart and with reverence for the Lord, as though they are working for the Lord himself and not the human master. So that one even puts God as a stand-in for the slave owner. Ephesians 6:5-8 is basically the same as the Colossians one. There are plenty of verses all throughout the New Testament telling slaves to be good little chattel, but maybe if we look hard enough we can find a command for slave owners. Now, what do you think that command would say? Well, Colossians 4:1 is the only New Testament verse that I am aware of that gives a command directly to the slave owners. And what does it say? Does it say to set the slaves free? No, of course not. It says, "Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven." No command to free the slaves, no command to not own people as property, just be nice to the slaves that you do have. And on top of everything here, I've been keeping exclusively to the New Testament. Most people think of biblical slavery as an Old Testament thing, compromises that God made for people who weren't ready and wouldn't have listened to a message outlawing slavery anyway, like Jesus said with the divorce thing when a Pharisee asked him. Those were the laws that God provided because the people weren't ready for the proper laws, but they weren't ideal. Now, one wonders why a group of people who had just been freed from slavery wouldn't be receptive to a "don't own slaves" command, but even if I grant that argument, the New Testament still provides us with plenty of guidance on how to perpetuate the institution of slavery, so the Bible approves of it.
But does this mean the slave trade, that's such a shameful part of our history, is actually something the Bible supports?
Leviticus 25:44 through 46 says, "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly." So, given that these are literally instructions on which nations you're allowed to engage in the slave trade with, I'm going to go with yes.
No.
Your tone of voice there suggests that you consider this to be the obvious answer, which is interesting given how obvious it is that the Bible approves of slavery.
And here are 3 reasons why. First, the slavery talked about in the Bible was more like servitude.
Well, first and foremost, you're just flat out wrong, but we'll get into that later. Second, the Bible, despite Christian protestations to the contrary, is not a monolithic book. The topic of slavery comes up several times in books that were separated by hundreds of years of time. Like, considering the latest possible date for the Old Testament books and the earliest possible date for the New Testament books, the Old Testament legal code version of slavery was written about 600 years before the New Testament Obey Your Master's version. That's nearly 2.5 times longer than the United States has existed as a country. One set of documents was written as a legal code that it was intended to set the Israelites apart from the other Canaanite tribes in the area. The other was a series of instructional letters trying to help churches of a new religion navigate a very different cultural climate, where most were located in a vassal state of the very much not Christian Roman Empire. Now, if we assume that these books are written by human beings and not the all-powerful creator of the universe, instructing a subjugated people that are members of a new religion that is generally frowned upon, making sure to emphasize the authority-respecting, not boat-rocking nature of this new religion, is a way to ensure survival. Don't worry, Roman people, we're not going to start a slave revolt. See, look, our leaders just sent us a letter telling slaves to be good for their masters. And hey, look, in this letter that was sent to a church in Rome, the author instructed the church there to be subject to the governing authorities, with punishment from God coming to those who resist the authorities. So we're not a bad religion that's going to start a revolt, we're a good one, you can tolerate us. So, if you want to split hairs about what the word slavery means, you need to be thorough and explain the difference between all the different kinds of slavery that we do find in the Bible, everything from the indentured servitude of Exodus 21 to the chattel slavery of Leviticus 25, to the prisoners of war in Deuteronomy 20, to the Roman slavery of the New Testament, and more.
When we hear the word slavery, we usually think of slave ships carrying Africans away from their home to be bought and sold as the property of white people in other parts of the world.
Yes, that is what we think of today, because most people living where my audience is most likely to live never directly encounter any of the forms of slavery that still widely exist today. But here's a fun fact that apologists seem to be oblivious to. Whatever form slavery may be found in, one thing remains consistent. It is a bad thing. One might even say it's evil.
But the Hebrew word, sometimes translated as slavery in the Bible, refers to something very different. Now, before the development of modern economies that led to the kind of wealth we see today, and governments capable of offering large welfare systems, cultures developed ways to deal with the problem of poverty.
I mean, first and foremost, the system that creates a lot of wealth today still very much relies on slavery. It just happens in areas that are out of sight for the consumers, and out of sight means out of mind. But more importantly here, we're talking about the law that you believe was given to the ancient Hebrews by the omnipotent creator of the universe. If anyone could think of an equitable system that would adequately care for the poor in a way that is not entirely exploitative, you'd think the omnipotent creator of the universe would be the one to do it. But apparently not. Enslaving the poor was the best he could come up with. Like, just think about what you're suggesting here. God couldn't think of a way to provide a social safety net for the poor, so he instituted a system by which they would be enslaved as a way of providing for them. Even if I grant that what you are saying is universally true of every instance where the word slave shows up in the Bible, that's appalling.
And because in Old Testament times, there was no such thing as a government assistance program, people would often sell themselves to have the basic necessities of food and shelter.
I think the best part of this is that the What Would You Say channel is very much against the idea of government welfare programs.
Jesus never advocated for government coercion to help the poor. Socialism depends on forcing people to do things they don't want to do. Now, Jesus' belief that charity should be done voluntarily is also seen in Matthew 26:11.
So, given that they are against government welfare programs, and that they are saying that the way the poor were cared for before the advent of government welfare programs was by enslaving them, does this mean that they are advocating for a return of a system where the poor are enslaved? That might not be what they are explicitly saying, but when you put two and two together, that definitely seems to be the implication.
Slavery, in this sense, was a type of social safety net. Slavery was also a way to deal with bankruptcy. Those who could not repay a debt would sell themselves to repay it.
And that is a bad thing. Unequivocally, people are not property.
But this kind of slavery was usually not for life unless one voluntarily did so.
And by voluntarily did so, they're referring to that verse in Exodus 21 where women were not privy to this temporary indentured servitude and were permanent slaves, which a slave master could give to his slaves as their wives. However, if you were given a wife by your master, then when it came time for you to go free, your wife and children would not go with you. They would remain slaves. So women are permanent slaves, not slaves who are temporarily enslaved to pay off a debt, and children born into slavery also seem to be permanent slaves, whether they be male or female. As such, if a man was a temporary slave who was given a wife while enslaved, and he had children with her, if he wanted to continue to have access to his wife and children, he had to pledge himself to be a permanent slave. So it's not they're only temporary slaves unless they freely choose to become permanent slaves. It's a man who voluntarily entered into indentured servitude was a temporary slave, but he could be pressured into becoming a permanent slave if the slave master holds their wife and children hostage. Seems a tad less rosy than you're presenting here.
In the Jewish law, servitude would last 6 years. The slaves would be freed in the 7th year.
According to the law in Exodus 21, yes. But according to the law in Leviticus 25, it could be up to 49 years. Every 50th year is a year of Jubilee in which you forgive the debts of those who owe you and set your indentured servants free. But it's not 50 years from when they become a slave, it's every 50th year according to a shared calendar. So maybe you'll only be an indentured servant for 1 year, maybe you'll be one for 49 years, but inevitably most will be longer than 6 years. And Leviticus 25 also happens to be the chapter where it explicitly states that you can purchase permanent slaves from the nations around you, slaves that do not go free in the year of Jubilee, and can be passed down to your children as inherited property forever. It's presented as a kind of compromise. Yeah, you do have to free your Hebrew slaves in the year of Jubilee, but don't worry, you can still get free labor from the slaves that you buy from non-Hebrew nations.
And every 50 years, in what was called the year of Jubilee, all debts were wiped out.
Interesting how you miss the direct contradiction between these two laws, all while clearly being aware of it. And as long as we're talking about the direct contradiction between biblical slavery laws, Exodus 21 explicitly states that women do not go free in the 7th year as the men do, while Deuteronomy 15:12 explicitly states that the women do go free in their 7th year. And interestingly enough, apologists tend to reference the misogynistic laws of Exodus when talking about slavery, while pretending that the Deuteronomy law that treats men and women the same way doesn't even exist. I suspect that the reason for this is because the law in Deuteronomy also makes it much more clear that they are talking exclusively about Hebrew slaves rather than it being a general principle. So while the Exodus law still applies only to Hebrew slaves, it's much easier to twist that to make it seem like it's universally applicable. But even if I grant that, it's universally applicable to men. Women get fucked over in the Exodus law.
It is undoubtedly true that some slaves were treated terribly,
including the Hebrew indentured servants. After all, Exodus 21 not only tells you how to keep your Hebrew slaves, but tells you how much you're allowed to beat them. And there are a couple possible translations of that verse that make it mean slightly different things, but none are moral. It's either that you can beat them as much as you like as long as they are still able to get up after a day or two, or you can beat them as much as you like as long as they take longer than 2 days to die from the beating. Both potential translations are heinous and immoral.
But that's not because the Bible encouraged it or even permitted it.
The Bible explicitly both encouraged and permitted it, and demanded that slaves be obedient to even the cruelest of masters.
Though many nations at that time would take slaves after war, Israel was not permitted to do so.
Really? Because Deuteronomy 20:10-14 says, "When you approach a city to fight against it, you must make an offer of peace. If it accepts your offer of peace and opens its gates to you, all the people found in it will become forced laborers for you and serve you. However, if it does not make peace with you but wages war against you, lay siege to it. When the Lord your God hands it over to you, you must strike down all its males with the sword, but you may take the women, children, animals, and whatever else is in the city, all its spoil, as plunder. You may enjoy the spoil of your enemies that the Lord your God has given you. In modern parlance, that means that a city that the Hebrews attacked had two choices. Option 1 is that they give up without a fight, and everybody in the city becomes a slave. Option 2 is that they can put up a fight, in which case a Hebrew victory would mean that all the men are slaughtered, and all the women and children become slaves. That sounds an awful lot like taking slaves after war. What's more, this isn't a description of how the Hebrews behaved, with their behavior being frowned upon by God. This is the description of how God says they ought to behave. And did I mention that in context, that's actually how they're to treat the nations that are far away from them? The ones that are nearby are supposed to be completely wiped out through genocide.
Second, slaves were to be treated as people, not property.
Leviticus 25:46, when talking about the slaves that you buy from the nations around you, says, "You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life." That sounds an awful lot like treating them as property, so much so that the Bible itself literally calls them property. And there's no ambiguity in translation here. The word translated as property is used 66 times throughout the Bible, and every single time it refers to possessing something as property. It is never used in any other sense.
Because Israelite servitude was not rooted in racism or even classism.
Okay. You literally spent the entirety of the last section explaining that slavery was something that was done as a way of providing for poor people. Sure, they have to work without pay, but at least they have a roof over their heads and food's in their belly. And now you're saying that it wasn't based on race or class? So when exactly did rich people sell themselves into slavery in order to afford the basic necessities of life? But contradicting yourself aside, it also doesn't matter what criteria were used when determining who could be a slave. Slavery is still wrong.
Servants had legal protections in Israel. If a master, or like an employer, permanently injured a servant, the servant would be set free without any debt. And to strike and kill a servant meant capital punishment.
I mean, if we're going that route, then the Georgian Constitution of 1798 states that any person who shall maliciously dismember or deprive a slave of life shall suffer such punishment as would be inflicted in the case like offense had been committed on a free white person, and on like proof, except in case of insurrection of such slave, and unless such a death should happen by accident in giving such a slave moderate correction. This was then copied into the slave codes nearly verbatim in Alabama, Missouri, and Texas. The original Georgia Constitution version was actually the worst of the lot. Alabama and Texas left out the bit about moderate correction, which surely would have been the excuse of any slave owner should charges be brought, while Missouri not only omitted that bit, but also left out the part about insurrection. Then we have things like Article 173 of the Louisiana Civil Code of 1847, which says, "The slave is entirely subject to the will of his master, who may correct and chastise him, though not the unusual rigor, nor so as to maim or mutilate him, or to expose him to the danger of loss of life, or to cause his death." Article 192 of the same code has a provision where a slave owner can be forced by the court to sell a slave if it is deemed that he has been too cruel to the slave. That would be to protect the slave from their cruel master. And this is where we run into the main issue that the slavery-defending apologists always fail to address. They compare the legal codes of biblical slavery to the actual behavior of slave owners in the time of the Atlantic slave trade, instead of just looking at the slave codes. Because when you look at the laws, American South in particular, many of them seem to be very heavily based on the biblical laws about slavery. There's even a spot, again in the Louisiana Civil Code, that states that a master who frees a slave is obligated to provide for the subsistence of the slave, similar to Deuteronomy 15:14, which says that when a Hebrew slave goes free, you need to provide for them. Hell, as long as we're making this comparison, slavery in the United States was also a two-tiered system where people could be indentured servants for a period of time, either as a way of paying off debts or as part of an apprenticeship. And those indentured servants had more legal protections than actual slaves, just like we see in the Bible. What's more, in the American system, there was not a provision where the master of an indentured servant could hold the servant's family hostage as a way of pressuring him into becoming a chattel slave, making the American system superior in this regard. Now, do I point this out to suggest that American slavery was actually A-okay? No. Absolutely not. I point this out to shine light on the fact that apologists are not engaging in a fair comparison when they look at the behavior of American slave owners and compare it just to the legal code of the Bible. In order to make a fair comparison, we either have to look at just the behavior of both or just the legal codes. Since we don't really have a record of the actual behavior from ancient Israel, we're left with just the legal code. And if it played out anything like it did in the United States, then despite the scant legal protections that slaves had in ancient Israel, it would have been at least as heinous as American slavery.
Israel was also commanded to harbor runaway slaves from surrounding nations, where they might be treated cruelly.
And the easy thing for me to do here would be to say, yeah, the Bible contains contradictions. Tell me something I don't know. But when have I ever made things easy on myself? Remember, one of the purposes of the Hebrew law was for them to find a way to stand out from their neighbors, and the command to harbor runaway slaves from other nations definitely accomplishes this. It is unique in the ancient Near East. Now, first and foremost, this is not a law regarding slavery among the Hebrews. That is still very clearly allowed and includes chattel slavery that was at least as bad as American slavery. Rather, this is a law regarding escaped slave from other nations. And given how xenophobic the Bible is towards other nations, it makes a certain amount of sense that they would want to encourage the formation of a reputation that would make them seem appealing to the slaves of those nations. And this kind of plays into the interpretation of that command that is given by the renowned commentator Abraham ibn Ezra for this verse. He says that because it follows immediately after a section that provided rules for how military camps should be organized, it could be assumed to be referring to slaves that escape from an enemy army and seek refuge with the Hebrew army. If an escaped slave from an enemy army is asking you for shelter, it would just be good tactics to give it to them, possibly in exchange for information. Other commentators interpret it as kind of a way of encouraging conversion. The reason the escaped slave chose to go to Israel is because they want to worship the God of Israel, so denying them the opportunity would dishonor God. But yeah, worst case scenario here, we have a contradiction in the Bible. I know that those things exist. Do you?
To harbor runaway slaves in other countries often meant the death penalty. In Exodus, the Bible demands the death penalty for slave traders.
Yes, but given the fact that this is right in the middle of a section that explains how you're supposed to obtain and treat slaves, this can be taken as an indication that the Exodus slaves laws are specifically referring to Hebrews rather than being more generally applicable. If someone tries to kidnap and enslave a Hebrew, they are put to death. But it's okay to do it to foreigners, as we see elsewhere in the Bible.
Roman slavery, in the context of the New Testament era, was a different system.
Oh, so you do recognize that culture changes over the centuries. That's good, I guess.
Roman slaves who were taken in battle were still allowed to marry, have families, purchase their freedom, and have others purchase their freedom.
As were American slaves, though often with some caveats on the marriage part. What's your point?
The New Testament, like the Old Testament, recognizes the humanity of every person, regardless of their station in life.
Then why no command for Christian slave owners to release their slaves? If you recognize the humanity of the person you own as property, then you must also recognize that it is wrong to own that person as property, so you will set them free. But God couldn't even get that right, apparently.
The Apostle Paul even considered Roman slaves to be co-workers in his ministry.
The only part of the New Testament where I can see anything like that happening is the book of Philemon, where Paul is asking Philemon to free one of his slaves, Onesimus, so that he could work with him. So, yeah, he can be my coworker once he's free, isn't quite up to the slaves are coworkers in my ministry thing that you're saying. Also worth mentioning is that Paul, in that letter, explicitly states that he has the authority to order Philemon to free Onesimus, but instead he's requesting it and offering to pay for his freedom if necessary. There is no recognition here that slavery is wrong, it's merely a case of, hey, I got to know this guy who is a slave and I like him, so I'd like it if he were free. And though it doesn't explicitly state that he was a runaway slave in that letter, that is a fairly common interpretation among apologists, and Paul sends him back to Philemon with the letter asking for his freedom. It would have been well within Roman law at the time for Philemon to have him executed. The only other time he's mentioned in the Bible is Colossians 4:9, where the author mentions that he's coming to Colossae with the letter. Colossians is one of the Pauline epistles of disputed authenticity, but if we assume that it was written by Paul, it's not unlikely that it would have been written and sent at the same time as Philemon, given that Philemon lived in Colossae. So it's kind of a, well, you're there, presumably being freed by your master, go visit this other church too, sort of thing. However, this is the last we hear of Onesimus. We never find out for certain if he was freed. It is entirely possible that Paul sent him to his death. And from what else we see about slavery in the New Testament, it seems unlikely that such a death would be considered a bad thing. Sure, Paul asked him to free Onesimus, but he made it clear that this was not a command and was to be done completely voluntarily. So if Philemon didn't want to free him, he would have been well within his rights to execute him, both from a legal standpoint and from a religious standpoint from how Paul worded his letter.
And because slavery was a common part of the culture in which Christianity was birthed, first-century Christians were both slaves and slave owners.
Why does it matter what the culture of the time did? John 15:19 says, "If you were of the world would love you as its own, but because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you." Romans 12:2 says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." The Bible is clear. You are not to conform to the culture of the world. So why was slavery being a part of the culture of the world something that was just accepted and means that it was okay for Christians to be slave owners? Using that logic, should you guys not just be okay with gay marriage since that's just a part of our culture today? Why is it okay for modern Christians to fight tooth and nail against aspects of our culture that they don't like, but for Christians back then, heinously immoral things like slavery were perfectly tolerable because they were part of the culture?
Christian masters and slaves were instructed to engage in activities like eating meals and then the Lord's Supper together.
I'm going to need a verse for that claim, because of all the New Testament verses, there's only one that I'm aware of that gives slave owners any command regarding their slaves, and it isn't to take communion with them, it's to treat them justly and fairly. And since there are Bible verses explicitly telling you to beat your slaves, presumably treating them justly and fairly includes beating them.
That would undermine and subvert slavery.
Something that the New Testament authors seem to be carefully avoiding. Possibly because, as mentioned earlier, they didn't want to be seen as the new religion that was likely to stir up a slave revolt.
New Testament writers used the language of family intimacy, such as greet one another with a holy kiss.
None of the verses they have listed there have anything to do with slavery. They're all just literally part of the sign-off of the letters. It just seems to be a rather standard sign-off for Paul.
Thus, in dozens of places, the New Testament is clear that our value as human beings, slave or free, is the same.
Then I am once again asking, why is there no command to not own slaves? The institution of slavery inherently imparts unequal values on the people involved. The slave is worth less than the master. If they were equal, then a slave wouldn't be a slave.
In this way, Christianity planted the seeds that would ultimately lead to the undermining of both ancient Roman slavery as well as modern slavery.
Ancient Roman slavery gradually evolved into European serfdom, a system that was effectively slavery even if it didn't share the name. And on top of that, despite the common misconception that out-and-out slavery didn't exist in medieval Europe, it was alive and well. In fact, the Atlantic slave trade began in the early 1500s, essentially as soon as Europeans started crossing the Atlantic regularly. It doesn't make sense that they began a slave trade operation specifically to cater to the newly discovered continents. It makes more sense that Europeans were already engaged in slave trade, and so when Europeans moved to a new continent, they took that already existing slave trade with them. It was also the Enlightenment that is largely responsible for the abolitionist movement, not Christianity. Now, certainly there were abolitionist Enlightenment figures who were Christian, but more often than not, their abolitionist tendencies were informed by their Enlightenment principles rather than their religion. For example, the Quakers were the first religious group to unilaterally condemn the institution of slavery. But this didn't happen until after Anthony Benezet converted to Quakerism and heavily influenced them with his Enlightenment views that he had developed before converting to Quakerism. Likewise, the first European country to abolish slavery was Denmark in 1803, under the regency of Prince Frederick VI, who was very heavily influenced by Enlightenment thinkers. The founding fathers of the United States, who were the most vocal in their opposition to slavery, were also the ones who are most well known for not being Christian, like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine. Christianity perpetuated the institution of slavery throughout Europe during the Middle Ages, and slavery didn't start to decline until Christianity began losing its near-total control.
And this leads to the final point. Christians ended the slave trade.
Oh, god damn it, I blew my load early on this one. I swear this never happens. I'll be good to go again soon, just give me like 5 minutes.
The Christianization of Europe eventually led to the disappearance of slavery until its modern form emerged in the 15th century.
Yeah, so that's them falling for the 18th and 19th century propaganda that had people believing that slavery didn't exist in medieval Europe, despite the fact that churches would often directly own slaves themselves. Now, to be fair, the churches would sometimes pay their slaves a very tiny wage, usually in the form of allowing them to keep a portion of their crop. But in true church fashion, their slaves would then be required to tithe to the church. So here's a pitifully tiny amount of compensation for your hard labor, now give me back 10% of it. Now, granted, church slaves usually had much easier lives than non-church slaves, but the fact remains that the church not only encouraged the expansion of the slave trade through their policies, they were also direct customers of the slave trade.
And then it was a Christian, William Wilberforce, who led the effort to eliminate the slave trade in England.
Yes, like I said, you can find Christians who were abolitionists. Wilberforce was definitely a Christian. It's even possible to trace the advent of Victorian-era prudery to his activism, so it's not like he was one of these liberal Christians who were fighting for abolition based on Enlightenment principles, though it is undeniable that he was influenced by these principles. But the Christians defending slavery using the Bible were much louder at the time than those who opposed it, and in the places where slavery was abolished, it was usually enacted by people in spite of their religion, not because of it. Revolutionary France, often criticized by apologists for being a bastion of atheistic thought, was one of the earliest European nations to outlaw slavery. Abe Lincoln, the American president largely credited with freeing the slaves, was frequently attacked by the press for not being Christian, and the strongest defense he ever made against these accusations was not to say, "No, I am a Christian." It was to say, "Yeah, I'm not a member of any particular church, but I never said that Christianity's not true." Direct quote, "That I am not a member of any Christian church is true, but I have never denied the truth of scriptures, and I have never spoken with intentional disrespect of religion in general, or any denomination of Christians in particular." If he were a Christian, it would have been an easy matter for him to simply say so, but the best he could do is to say that he never attacked Christianity.
It was Christian abolitionist preachers during the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century that started the sustained effort to abolish slavery in the United States.
Led originally by the Quakers, who were under the influence of Enlightenment principles, not the Bible.
It was a Christian pastor, Martin Luther King Jr., who led the civil rights movement of the 20th century in the United States.
Yes, he was most definitely a Christian. And he wrote scathing rebukes of the many Christians who opposed his actions. Read his letter from a Birmingham jail sometime. In case you don't, let me quote part of it here. "I felt we would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous, and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. In spite of my shattered dreams, I came to Birmingham with the hope that the white religious leaders of this community would see the justice of our cause with deep moral concern, would serve as the channel through which our just grievances could reach the power structure. I had hoped that each of you would understand, but again, I have been disappointed." After another couple paragraphs outlining his deep disappointment with the church, he goes on to say, "Yes, I see the church as the body of Christ, but oh, how we have blemished and scarred that body through social neglect and through fear of being nonconformists." And then he continues explaining his disappointment in the church, even going so far as to say that if it continues down the path that he saw it on at the time, it would lose its authenticity and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. And earlier in the letter, when he was talking about his sense of justice and morality, he described it in ways that leave the door open to secular interpretations. "A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law." He doesn't say that it squares with the moral law, which is the law of God. It squares with the moral law or the law of God. He was a man who was very careful in his use of words. That "or" was definitely a deliberate way of making sure he was not excluding the non-religious or members of other religions from being able to differentiate between just and unjust laws. So, yeah, he was a highly influential figure in the fight for civil rights, as doesn't even really need saying, and he managed that in spite of the church, not because of it.
This followed a long history of Christians working for human rights because of the gospel's commitment to the equal dignity of every person.
So even if I set aside everything I just said about how the Enlightenment, not the church, was responsible for ending the Atlantic slave trade, and how Martin Luther King Jr. was influential in spite of Christianity rather than because of it, then the worst case scenario for my argument here is that the same thing applies as when creationists say that most scientists before the theory of evolution was discovered were Christian. In a Christian society where not being a Christian would lead directly to your persecution, of course most people doing anything would be Christian. But as with science, whenever Christianity was informing their actions, it acted as a hindrance rather than a help.
The history of slavery is a difficult and important conversation.
Which is why it is equally important that you not lie about it like you have in this video. As you stated, plenty of Christians were involved in the abolitionist movement, and there were secular Enlightenment thinkers who were against abolitionism. Well, I mean, you didn't say that last one, that's just me being intellectually honest here. Turns out, the history of how a nearly universal institution like slavery was abolished is more complicated than one group of people opposed it and managed to fight it off, no matter which group you think was behind most of the fighting. People are complex, as it turns out, so a history of how millions of these complex people interacted with each other becomes even more complex. But one thing is certain, the Bible explicitly condones slavery. So whatever Christians may have done to help end the slave trade, it was done in spite of the Bible, not because of it. Also, just to reiterate, I am speaking specifically of the slavery that we tend to think of today as, the Atlantic slave trade, with the most notorious version being that which was instituted in the American South. Slavery as an institution still exists in many places in the world today, and undoubtedly, everyone watching this will have benefited from it in one way or another. There are still nearly 50 million people that live in slavery today, and most of those are in the form of slavery that she spent the first third of this video defending, indentured servitude to pay off debts. So keep that in mind when you hear an apologist talking about how indentured servitude is the gentle, nice form of slavery. They are saying that the people who are actively being enslaved today are actually being taken care of by their wealthy benefactors. And that's just a disgusting position to argue for. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Nitro Indigo, who says, "Species were invented by Big Taxa to sell more biology textbooks." You know what? With the scam that is modern college and university textbooks, that's probably the most plausible conspiracy theory I've ever heard. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern, and with my partner every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, Permine for being this week's PayPal hero, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Medicant Friar, Pumbaa, and all the rest, who are the Enlightenment thinkers who ended the slavery that is my channel. If you'd like future apologists to credit your actions to their religion, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!